Thoughts on the Revival of Religion in New England, 1740, to which is prefixed the narrative of the surprising work of God in Northampton, Massachusetts, 1735, by Jonathan Edwards. This has been read by Peter John Paristes, also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God. Chapter 26. Wrong Principles. Perversions of the teachings of the Spirit, securing a present good regardless of consequences. Another erroneous principle that some have embraced, which has been a source of many errors in their conduct, is that persons ought always to do whatsoever the Spirit of God, though but indirectly, inclines them to. Indeed, the Spirit of God in itself is infinitely perfect, and all his immediate actings, simply considered, are perfect, and there can be nothing wrong in them, and therefore all that the Spirit of God inclines us to, directly and immediately without the intervention of any other cause that shall pervert and misimprove what is from the Spirit of God, ought to be done. But there may be many things that we may be disposed to do, which disposition may indirectly be from the Spirit of God, that we ought not to do. The disposition in general may be good, and be from the Spirit of God, but the particular determination of that disposition as to particular actions, objects, and circumstances may be ill, and not from the Spirit of God, but may be from the intervention or interposition of some infirmity, blindness, inadvertency, deceit, or corruption of ours, so that although the disposition in general ought to be allowed and promoted, and all those actings of it that are simply from God's Spirit, yet the particular ill direction or determination of that disposition, which is from some other cause, ought not to be followed. As, for instance, the Spirit of God may cause a person to have a dear love to another, and so a great desire of delight in his comfort, ease, and pleasure. This disposition in general is good, and ought to be followed. But yet, through the intervention of discretion or some other bad cause, it may be ill-directed and have a bad determination as to particular acts, and the person indirectly, through the real love that he has to his neighbor, may kill him with kindness, or he may do that out of sincere goodwill to him, which may tend to ruin him. A good disposition may, through some inadvertency or delusion, strongly incline a person to that which, if he saw all things as they are, would be most contrary to that disposition. The true loyalty of a general and his zeal for the honor of his prince may exceedingly animate him in war. But yet this, that is a good disposition, through indiscretion and mistake, may push him forward to those things that give the enemy great advantage, and may expose him and his army to ruin. He may tend to the ruin of his master's interests. The apostle does evidently suppose that the Spirit of God and its extraordinary, immediate, and miraculous influences on men's minds may be in some respect excite inclinations in men that, if gratified, would tend to confusion, and therefore must sometimes be restrained, and in their exercise must be under the government of discretion. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 31 through 33. For ye may all prophesy, one by one, that all may learn, and all may be comforted. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Here by the spirit of the prophets, according to the known phraseology of the apostle, is meant the Spirit of God acting in the prophets according to those special gifts with which each one was endowed. And here it is plainly implied that the Spirit of God thus operating in them may be an occasion of their having sometimes an inclination to do that in the exercise of those gifts which it was not proper, decent, or profitable that they should, and that therefore the inclination, though indirectly from the Spirit of God, should be restrained, and that it ought to be subject to the discretion of the prophets as to the particular time and circumstances of its exercise. I can make no doubt but that it is possible for a minister to have given him by the Spirit of God such a sense of the importance of eternal things and of the misery of mankind, that are so many of them exposed to eternal destruction, together with such a love to souls, that he might find in himself a disposition to spend all his time, day and night, in warning, exhortation, and calling upon men, and so that he must be obliged, as it were, to do violence to himself ever, to refrain, so as to give himself any opportunity to eat, drink, or sleep. And so I believe there may be a disposition in like manner indirectly excited in laypersons through the intervention of their infirmity to do what belongs to ministers only, yea, to do those things that would not become either minister or people. Through the influence of the Spirit of God, together with want of discretion and some remaining corruption, women and children might feel themselves inclined to break forth and scream aloud to great congregations, warning and exhorting the whole multitude, and to go forth and hallow and scream in the streets, or to leave the families they belong to and go from house to house, earnestly exhorting others. But yet it would by no means follow that it was their duty to do these things, or that they would not have a tendency to do 10 times as much hurt as good. Another wrong principle from whence have arisen errors in conduct is that whatsoever is found to be a present and immediate benefit may and ought to be practiced without looking forward to future consequences. Some persons seem to think that it sufficiently justifies anything that they say or do that is found to be for their present edification and edification of those that are with them. It assists and promotes their present affection, and therefore they think they should not concern themselves about future consequences, but leave them with God. Indeed, in things they are in themselves our duty, being required by moral rules or absolute positive commands of God. They must be done, and future consequences be left with God. Our choice and discretion have no place here. But in other things we are to be governed by discretion, and must not only look at the present good, but our view must be extensive, and we must look at the consequences of things. It is the duty of ministers especially to exercise this discretion in things wherein they are not determined by an absolute rule, and that are not enjoined them by a wisdom superior to their own. Christ has left them to their own discretion, with a general rule that they should exercise the utmost wisdom they can obtain in pursuing that which, upon the best view of the consequences of things, will tend most to the advancement of his kingdom. This is implied in those words of Christ to his disciples when he sent them forth to preach the gospel. Matthew 10, verse 16. Be ye wise as serpents. The scripture also represents the work of a gospel minister by those employments that especially require wise foresight and provision for the future. So it is compared to the business of a steward, which is a business that in an eminent manner requires forecast and a wise laying in of provision for the supply of the need of the family according to its future necessities, and a good minister is called a wise steward. So it is compared to the business of a husbandman, that almost wholly consists in things done with a view to the future fruits and consequences of his labor. The husbandman's discretion and forecast is eloquently set forth in Isaiah chapter 28, verses 24 through 26. Doth the plowman plow all day to sow? Doth he open and break the clods of his ground? When he hath made plain the face thereof, does he not cast abroad and scatter the cumin, and cast in the principal wheat, and the appointed barley and the rye in their place? For his God doth instruct him to discretion, and doth teach him. So the work of the minister is compared to that of a wise builder or architect who has a long reach and comprehensive view, and for whom it is necessary that when he begins a building he should have at once a view of the whole frame and all the future parts of the structure, even to the pinnacle, that all may be fitly framed together. So also it is compared to the business of a trader or merchant, who is to gain by trading with the money that he begins with. This also is a business that exceedingly requires forecast, and without it is never like to be followed with any success for any long time. So it is represented by the business of a fisherman, which depends on craft and subtlety. It is also compared to the business of a soldier that goes to war, which is a business that perhaps above any other secular business requires great foresight and a wise provision for future events and consequences. And particularly ministers ought not to be careless how much they discompose and ruffle the minds of those that they esteem natural men, or how great an uproar they raise in the carnal world, and so lay blocks in the way of the propagation of religion. This certainly is not to follow the example of the zealous Apostle Paul, who, though he would not depart from his enjoined duty to please carnal men, yet wherein he might with a good conscience did exceedingly lay out himself to please them, and if possible to avoid raising in the multitude prejudices, oppositions, and tumults against the gospel, and look upon it that it was a great consequence that it should be, if possible, avoided. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 32 and 33. Give none offense.
Thoughts on the revival of religion. Neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Yea, he declares that he laid himself out so much for this, that he made himself a kind of a servant to all sorts of men, conforming to their customs and various humors, in everything wherein he might, even in things that were very burdensome to him, that he might not frighten men away from Christianity, and cause them to stand, as it were, braced and armed against it, but on the contrary, if possible, might with condescension and friendship win and draw them to it, as you may see in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. Agreeably here, too, are the directions he gives to others, both ministers and people. So he directs the Christians, Romans, not to please themselves, but everyone please his neighbor for his good, to edification. Romans 15, verse 1 and 2, and to follow after the things that make for peace. Chapter 14, verse 19. And he expresses it in terms exceedingly strong. Romans 12:18. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. And he directs ministers to endeavor, if possible, to gain opposers by a meek, condescending treatment, avoiding all appearance of strife or fierceness. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24 through 26. To the like purpose the same apostle directs Christians to walk in wisdom towards them that are without. Ephesians 4:5. And to avoid giving offense to others, if we can, that our good may not be evil spoken of. Romans 14:16. So that it is evident that the great and most zealous and most successful propagator of vital religion that ever was, look upon it to be of great consequence to endeavor as much as possible, by all the methods of lawful meekness and gentleness, to avoid raising the prejudice and opposition of the world against religion. When we have done our utmost, there will be opposition enough against vital religion, against which the carnal mind of man has such an enmity. We should not, therefore, needlessly increase and raise that enmity, as in the apostles' days, though he took so much pains to please men, yet because he was faithful and thorough in his work, persecution almost everywhere was raised against him. A fisherman is careful not needlessly to ruffle and disturb the water, lest he should drive the fish away from his net, but he will rather endeavor, if possible, to draw them into it. Such a fisherman was the apostle. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 15 and 16. And I will very gladly spend and be spent for you. Although the more abundantly I love you, the less I be loved. But be it so, I did not burden you. Nevertheless, being crafty, I taught you with guile. The necessity of suffering persecution in order to be a true Christian has undoubtedly by some been carried to an extreme, and the doctrine has been abused. It has been looked upon as necessary to uphold a man's credit amongst others as a Christian, that he should be persecuted. I have heard it made an objection against the sincerity of particular persons that they were no more hated and reproached. And the manner of glorying in persecution or the cross of Christ has in some been very wrong, having too much the appearancy of priding themselves that they were very much hated and reviled, more than most, as an evidence of their exceeding others in being good soldiers of Jesus Christ. Such an improvement of the doctrine of the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and of the necessity of persecution, being credible and customary, has a direct tendency to cause those that would be accounted true Christians so to behave themselves towards those that are not well affected to religion as to provoke their hatred, or at least to be but very little careful to avoid it, and not very studiously and earnestly to strive, after the apostles' example and precepts, to please them to their edification, and by meekness and gentleness to win them, and by all possible means to live peaceably with them. I believe that saying of our Savior, "I came not to send peace on earth, but division," has been abused, as though when we see great strife and division arise about religion, and violent heats of spirit against the truly pious, and a loud clamor and uproar against the work of God, it was to be rejoiced in, because it is that which Christ came to send. It has almost been laid down as a maximum by some, that the more division and strife the better sign, which naturally leads persons to seek it and provoke it, or leads them to and encourage them in such a manner of behavior, such a roughness and sharpness, or such an affected neglect, as has a natural tendency to raise prejudice and opposition, instead of striving, as the apostle did, to his utmost, by all meekness, gentleness, and benevolence of behavior, to prevent or assuage it. Christ came to send a sword on earth, and to cause division. No otherwise than he came to send damnation. For Christ, who is sent for the glorious restoration of some, is sent for the fall of others, and to be a stone of stumbling and rock of offense to them, an occasion of their vastly more aggravated and terrible damnation. And this is always the consequence of a great outpouring of the Spirit and revival of vital religion. It is the means of the salvation of some, and the more aggravated damnation of others. But certainly this is no just argument that men's exposedness to damnation is not to be lamented, or that we should not exert ourselves to our utmost in all the methods that we can devise, that others might be saved, and to avoid all such behavior towards them as tends to lead them down to hell. I know there is naturally a great enmity in the heart of man against vital religion, and I believe there would have been a great deal of opposition against this glorious work of God in New England if the subjects and promoters of it had behaved themselves never so agreeably to Christian rules. And I believe if this work goes on and spreads much in the world so as to begin to shake kingdoms and nations, it will dreadfully stir up the rage of earth and hell, and will put the world into the greatest uproar that ever it was, and since it stood. I believe Satan's dying struggles will be the most violent. But yet I believe a great deal might be done to restrain this opposition by a good conformity to that of the Apostle James, chapter 3, verse 13, who is a wise man and endued with knowledge. Let him show out of good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. And I also believe that if the rules of Christian charity, meekness, gentleness, and prudency had been duly observed by the generality of the zealous promoters of this work, it would have made 3 times the progress that it has. That is, if it had pleased God in such a case to give a blessing to means in proportion as he has done. Under this head of carelessness of the future consequences of things, it may be proper to say something of introducing things new and strange, and that have a tendency by their novelty to shock and surprise people. Nothing can be more evident from the New Testament than that such things ought to be done with great caution and moderation to avoid the offense that may be thereby given, and the prejudices that might be raised to clog and hinder the progress of religion. Yea, that it ought to be thus in things that are in themselves good and excellent and of a great weight, provided they are not things that are of the nature of absolute duty, which, though they may appear to be innovations, yet cannot be neglected without immorality or disobedience to the commands of God. What great caution and moderation did the apostles use in introducing things that were new and abolishing things that were old in their day. How gradually were the ceremonial performances of the law of Moses removed and abolished among the Christian Jews, and how long did even the Apostle Paul himself conform to those ceremonies which he calls weak and beggarly elements, yea, even to the rite of circumcision, Acts 16, verse 3, that he speaks so much in his epistles of the worthlessness of, that he might not prejudice the Jews against Christianity. So it seems to have been very gradually that the Jewish Sabbath was abolished and the Christian Sabbath introduced for the same reason. And the apostles avoided teaching the Christians in those early days, at least for a great while, some high and excellent divine truths, because they could not bear them yet. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 1 and 2, Hebrews 5, verses 11 through 14. Thus strictly did the apostles observe the rule that their blessed Master gave them of not putting new wine into old bottles, lest they should burst the bottles and lose the wine. And how did Christ himself, while on earth, forbear so plainly to teach his disciples the great doctrines of Christianity concerning his satisfaction and the nature and manner of sinners' justification and reconciliation with God, and the particular benefits of his death, resurrection, and ascension, because in that infant state the minds of the disciples were not prepared for such instructions, and therefore the more clear and full revelation of these things was reserved for the time when their minds should be further enlightened and strengthened by the outpouring of the Spirit after his ascension. John chapter 16, verse 12 and 13. I have yet many things to say unto you, but ye cannot bear them now. Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will guide you into all truth. In Mark chapter 4, verse 33. With many such parables spake he the word unto them, as they were able to bear it. These things might be enough to convince any one that does not think himself wiser than Christ and his apostles, that great prudency and caution should be used in introducing things into the church of God that are very uncommon, though in themselves they may be very excellent, lest by our rashness and imprudent haste we hinder religion much more than we help it. Persons that are influenced by an indiscreet zeal are always in too much haste. They are impatient of delays, and therefore are for jumping to the utmost step first, before they have taken the preceding steps, whereby they expose themselves to fall and break their bones. It is a thing very taking with them to see the building rise very high, and all their endeavors and strength is employed in advancing the building in height, without taking care withal proportionably to enlarge the foundation, whereby the whole is in danger of coming to the ground. And they are for putting on the cupola and pinnacle before they are come to it, or before the lower parts of the building are done, which tends at once to put a stop to the building and hinder its ever being a complete structure. Many that are thus imprudent and hasty with their zeal have a real eager appetite for that which is good, but are like children. They are impatient to wait for the fruit until the proper season of it, and therefore snatch it before it is ripe. Oftentimes in their haste they overshoot their mark and frustrate their own end. They put that which they would obtain further out of reach than it was before, and establish and confirm that which they would remove. Things must have time to ripen. The prudent husbandman waits until he has received the former and the latter rain, until the harvest is ripe before he reaps. We are now, just as it were, beginning to recover out of a dreadful disease that we have been long under, and to feed a man recovering from a fever with strong meat at once is the ready way to kill him. The Reformation from popery was much hindered by this hasty zeal. Many were for immediately rectifying all disorders by force, which was condemned by Luther and was a great trouble to him. It is a vain prejudice that some have lately embidden against such rules of prudency and moderation. They will be forced to come to them at last. They will find themselves that they are not able to maintain their cause without them, and if they will not hearken before, experience will convince them at last, when it will be too late for them to rectify their mistake. Footnote. See Sleiden', History of the Reformation, page 52, etc., and book 5 throughout. End of footnote. End of chapter 26. Having been read by Peter John Paresis, also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory